Okay, so we are up to chapter 5, the second to last chapter in Pynchon's great novel, The Crying of Lot 49. And now at the beginning of this chapter, so Mucho Mas decides to drive up to Berkeley. One, she wants to get a copy of the original hardcover edition of the Revenge plays, the Jacobean Revenge plays, which she does. And she finds some variants that are interesting, but ultimately not that important. What is important, however, is her conversation with John Nefastus. And remember that Stanley Kotex at Yo-Yo-Dine had told her that John Nefastus had made a Nefastus machine, which what he calls a sensitive, which is basically a person with paranormal or psychic abilities, could focus on one of the pistons and get it to move just by telepathically or psychokinetically, I suppose is the correct term, thinking about it. So she wants to find out about this machine for reversing entropy. So she goes into Nefastus's apartment in Berkeley and sits down, and he tells her a little bit about thermodynamics and entropy, and he tells her that there are two different types of entropy. There's entropy as it is discussed in thermodynamics. There's physics, the physical version of entropy, but then there's also entropy as it is discussed in information theory, informational entropy, and that's the kind of entropy that Pynchon is really concerned with in this novel. Social waste, the kind of entropy that comes from the accumulation of the dispossessed, the preterite, those whom society has no use for, the bums, and this can even be artists, people who are out on the fringes somehow, who are not being taken in. They're not one of the elect. They're one of the passed over. And as they accumulate, all these sort of social rejects and outcasts, as they accumulate, they cause entropy. They build up entropy within the social system that can threaten to degrade the signal, which is one of the reasons why the Tristero has come into being, to counter this social degradation by giving the dispossessed an underground system to communicate, so that they can communicate with each other. That's the whole purpose of the Tristero, is this kind of reversal of entropy. Now, it's a little bit like in information theory, we have the so-called Shannon-Weaver model of communication, where you have this very naive model in which you have a signal that is sent from a sender through a channel to a receiver. So you have sender is A, receiver is B, and then there's a channel that connects them in between, and the signal moves through the channel. The only problem is that the signal is usually degraded or distorted by noise, and this is what corresponds to entropy in information theory. As the signal goes through the channel, inevitably there's some information loss in the form of static. The old analog telephones sometimes would get really staticky when you're talking to someone. That's the third party, what Michel Serre calls in his books the parasite, that degrades the signal. Now, in a way, Marshall McLuhan regards this model as totally naive, and he says the whole problem with it is that it does not take into account the particular bias of the medium through which the signal goes. Every signal is sent through a medium of some sort, and the medium is the message, not the signal. The medium is because the medium changes or biases or warps or distorts the content of what goes through it. For example, Neil Postman used to talk about how Sesame Street is not a program that taught children how to learn. It taught them how to like television. So there again, it was not the information content going through it. Here's literacy, here's the alphabet, but the medium itself, television, which transforms everything into entertainment automatically, and so was teaching children how to like television. That's an example of the medium, the necessity of the medium having to be taken into account. In a way, McLuhan is the founder, or at least co-founder, of media studies. In a way, his movement from his first book, that's published, I think, in 1950, The Mechanical Bride, to his later books, the ones that begin to take into account the medium being the message, which The Mechanical Bride did not. The Mechanical Bride was about the content, advertising, and the messages that are being sent out in advertising and popular culture, novels, paperbacks, Mad Magazine, comics. That first book, and it's still a very good book, is not authentically McLuhan yet, though, because he hasn't discovered the medium. He didn't discover that till reading his colleague at University of Toronto, Harold Innes, who wrote Empire and Communications, which was published about that time, 1950, which is a survey of the history of mediatic transformations that I've already gone through in the first video here, from clay tablets and cuneiform. That causes a certain bias in society, to papyrus, which also creates a bias, and so forth, all the way down to the printed book and to newspapers and so forth. And so after McLuhan published The Mechanical Bride and read Innes, that was when he began to shift to realizing that actually it's the medium that counts in media studies. That's why it's called media studies, because you're studying the different biases of each of the media. And so as McLuhan gets to understanding media, which is the big book that he publishes in 1964, in a way it parallels the difference between V, which is concerned with the Mechanical Bride and technology, the Lewis Mumfordian world of technological evolution, to Lot 49, which is concerned, as is understanding media now, with the medium, with information theory, and so forth. So this is my little footnote here to Nefastus's distinction between the two different types of entropy. And then so Oedipa wants to try and give his machine a shot. So she sits down and she tries to be psychokinetic and tries to get one of the pistons to move. And of course she has no luck. It says, oh, well, all right, well, let's have sex then. She's like, never mind, I'm out of here. So she leaves. So notice how her social encounters are usually something goes wrong. In almost every one of her social encounters, it somehow goes quickly into the trash. In almost every case, that's a telling fact about her, but it's also about the world of isolation and isolated individuals that Pynchon is painting here in this novel. And then so she moves along she decides to go across the Bay Bridge now and gets off in North Beach, parks her car there. I used to work in North Beach, so I know the neighborhood very well. She gets off, parks her car. She's in a crowd of people, and some guy slaps a badge on her chest randomly that says, "Hi, my name is Arnold Snarb, and I'm looking for a good time." She leaves it on her chest. Maybe she thinks it's funny. And then she goes into a gay bar called the Greek Way. She just, out of curiosity, decides to go in. She sits down at the bar, orders a drink, and then there's a guy next to her that has a lapel pin with the muted post horn, the symbol of the Tristero, on his lapel, on his jacket. And then she says, she says, "What if I told you that I was an agent of Turnantoxis?" He's like, "What are you talking about? What's that, some sort of a theatrical agency or something?" He seems to have no idea about the Tristero or any of that kind of history of the Postal Service. And she tells him everything that she's learned so far about the Tristero. He just kind of shrugs and says, "Well, geez, I don't know anything about such an organization. My organization actually is called IA, and here it's a kind of parody of AA. It's called IA, Enamorato Anonymous." Enamorato means someone who's enamored or in love with someone. And what we try to do is prevent people from falling in love, because it's a bad habit. It's an addiction. And what we do, if someone thinks they're falling in love, then quickly, like an AA calling a sponsor, if you're afraid you're going to drink, you call the person up, they send someone out who talks you out of it. And he says, "We're all isolates." And he says, "Well, it was founded by this executive who was working at Yoyodyne back in the early 60s, and he was out of a job due to automation. So he decided that he was going to kill himself. He had received a packet of letters, though, from who we do not know, of people who had decided not to commit suicide. And they gave various reasons, but the executive didn't find any of them convincing. And he saw the Buddhist monk in Vietnam who poured gasoline on himself and lit himself on fire. And for some reason, he thinks that's a fun way to commit suicide. So he's sitting in his house, dousing himself with gasoline. Then in comes his wife with a co-worker, and he spies on them, and as they're having an affair. And for some reason, he finds it funny, and he starts laughing, disrupts their affair. The guy gets creeped out and leaves. And then he decides to found Enamorato Anonymous, an organization that prevents people from falling in love. And the only affiliation they have with the Tristero is they know about the muted post horn, so they use it as their symbol. So all through this chapter, we get Oedipa discovering these little pockets, these little groups in various ways who are somehow affiliated with the Tristero, but they're all trying, unlike Enamorato Anonymous, they're trying to communicate with each other somehow. IA seems to be a reversal of the rule here. So then begins her journey through the entire night, on into the next day. She does not sleep. She wanders on foot through San Francisco, and everywhere she looks, she finds the muted post horn. She sees it in Chinatown, in a Chinese herbalist shop in the window there. She can just barely make it out, but she sees it clearly. She sees it scrawled in chalk, two of them in chalk on a sidewalk, like a child's game. There are two of them. She sees them scrawled as graffiti on the wall. She goes into a laundromat, and she sees it posted on the bulletin board at a laundromat, the post horn, with a message that says, "If you know what this means, you know where to find out more." And then she also, riding in a bus, sees scrawled on the back of the seat in front of her the acronym DEATH, DEATH, all in caps. It's another acronym like waste, only someone has spelled out that it means don't ever antagonize the horn. So it's everywhere, this Tristero conspiracy, and she spends the whole night wandering around, finding evidence for it. In one of the latrines was an advertisement by ACDC, standing for Alameda County Death Cult, along with a box number and post horn. Once a month, they were to choose some victim from among the innocent, the virtuous, the socially integrated and well-adjusted, using him sexually, then sacrificing him. Oedipus did not copy the number. So again, another one of these bizarre organizations, underground organizations that's affiliated somehow with the post horn, and hence the Tristero. But now she begins to realize what this is about, and this is where she moves into a world, a kind of dark country that a suburban housewife giving Tupperware parties has no knowledge of and never will. She's out in the world of the real, and she begins to encounter the dispossessed, the preterites, those whom society has passed over. There's an interesting paragraph that Pynchon writes where it says, so it went, Oedipus played the voyeur and listener. Among her other encounters were a facially deformed welder who cherished his ugliness, a child roaming the night who missed the death before birth as certain outcasts do, the dear lulling blankness of the community, a Negro woman with an intricately marbled scar along the baby fat of one cheek, who kept going through rituals of miscarriage, each for a different reason, deliberately as others might the ritual of birth, dedicated not to continuity but to some kind of interregnum, an aging night watchman nibbling at a bar of ivory soap, who had trained his virtuoso stomach to accept also lotions, air fresheners, fabrics, tobaccos, and waxes, in a hopeless attempt to assimilate it all the promised productivity, betrayal, ulcers, before it was too late. And even another voyeur who hung outside one of the city's still-lighted windows, searching for who knew what specific image, decorating each alienation, each species of withdrawal as cufflink, decal, aimless doodling. There was somehow always the post horn. She sees it everywhere in association with these social misfits and rejects. So she slowly finds herself beginning to become sympathetic with this world. And then as the morning comes, she's spent the entire night, the kind of dark night of the soul, wandering through San Francisco. She comes across an open doorway into a rooming house with stairs leading up, and on the staircase is sitting this man. And she notices that he has a post horn tattooed on one hand. And then he looks rather forlorn. He turns out to be a sailor. And she says, "Can I help?" And he says, "My wife's in Fresno. I left her so long ago I don't remember. Now this is for her." And he hands her a letter. And he says, "Drop it in the..." And he held up the tattoo and stared into her eyes. "You know, I can't go out there. It's too far now. I had a bad night." She says, "I know, but I'm new in town. I don't know where it is," namely the box for the letters for the Tristero that you mail them through. He says, "It's under the freeway. There's always one. You'll see it." She says, "I can't help you." But then a wave of compassion overcomes her and she hugs the man. And in many ways, that's the turning point for her in the novel, is this awakening of her compassion for the suffering of others that are being passed over by the mainstream. So then she does indeed go under the freeway. She goes under there where there's a lot of bums and winos and homeless people and so forth. And then she finds what appears to be a trash can, but someone has scrawled on the top of it the acronym WASTE with periods. And she realizes that it's a mailbox for the Tristero, so she drops the sailor's letter into the mailbox and she waits. And eventually a courier comes, shows up, opens up the trash can and digs all the letters out, puts them in his mailbag and leaves. And she decides to follow him. So she follows him and she watches him delivering letter after letter after letter. Then finally he meets up with another carrier. They swap bags. She decides to keep following that guy. gets on a bus and goes back across the bridge into Oakland and follows him, and then winds up coming full circle back to the house of John Nefastus, which of course she doesn't go into. She doesn't want to see him. But notice now the difference here with this scene, which is a crucial scene because for a couple of reasons. Number one is that it provides concrete evidence now for the existence of the Tristero. It does appear to be real. She has witnessed an actual box, mail box of theirs. She has seen an actual mail carrier of theirs show up, take the letters out, and deliver them. She's witnessed all of this. It does appear to be real. Also, she has moved from the status of an observer and a theoretician of what might be a paranoid conspiracy of the Tristero to now participating in it. She has mailed a letter via the Tristero underground mail system, so now she's a participant within it. So her status here in this chapter, which is crucial, has shifted from outsider to a certain degree anyway, to insider. She never really does get on the inside of the Tristero or even of the culture. She always remains an outsider to it. But at least by this point, she has participated in it. She decides when she returns back to San Francisco that she wants to see her shrink, a psychiatrist who is named Dr. Hilarius, of course. And but as she gets there, a couple of bullets whiz past her, and she goes up the steps, and his nurse tells Oedipa that he's gone crazy. He's shooting randomly at people. So maybe Oedipa can talk him some sense into him. So Oedipa goes outside his closed office door and starts talking to him. He doesn't know that it's that specifically Oedipa, his patient. And he says, so who's out to get you? And he says, oh, there's a few men. There's 3 men with guns who are out to get me. This vague, paranoid conspiracy that's non-specific. And then he reveals to her he's paranoid that somebody will find out that he used to work for the Nazis in one of the concentration camps, namely Buchenwald, where he worked there for them, trying to induce what he calls experimentally induced insanity. So he performed experiments there, but he got away and he decided to convert and become a Freudian. And Freud being a Jew, he says, you would have thought that I would have converted to Jung, but I didn't. I chose Freud. But now he's worried that he'll be found out, that the police will find out, and that he'll be taken like Eichmann back to Jerusalem and be tried for war crimes. Finally, he lets her in the office, or rather pulls her in, and she's like, so I'm a hostage now? And she sees that he's run out of ammo. She sees the gun lying on the desk there, and he's run out of ammo. The whole thing is comic. In Pynchon, all such scenes are just, they're comic, they're satire, not serious. And the cops show up, and then the media show up and vie on the front lawn for who gets the first scoop. And then the cops show up and arrest Dr. Hilarius. And then she leaves, goes out to the front lawn and finds the truck KCUF there. And her husband, Mucho Mas, is in the truck broadcasting. So she goes inside. And then he proceeds to interview her under the name of Edna Mosh. And here we have an instance of entropy, of information degradation. After the interview, she goes, Edna Mosh? And he says, oh, I've taken into account the fact that as you pronounce that through this analog sound system, it'll come out as Oedipa Mas. It'll correct it, so I had to make room for the distortion. So he is indeed taking the medium into account. And the other thing about Mucho Mas now is that he's gone a little bit crazy too in her absence. He is also one of Dr. Hilarius's patients, and Dr. Hilarius has put him on LSD, which I take it was still legal at this point, 1964. I don't think it had been made illegal yet. So he's taking LSD. And as they go to a diner to talk, he's listening to the Muzak, and he's analyzing it. He says, there are precisely 17 violins in that Muzak there. And he says, you know, I have this ability now where he says, you'll think I'm crazy, Ed, but I can do the same thing in reverse, listen to anything and take it apart again. Spectrum analysis in my head. I can break down chords and timbres and words too into all the basic frequencies and harmonics with all their different loudnesses and listen to them, each pure tone, but all at once. So now LSD has conferred on him this ability, but it's also giving him a kind of schizophrenic crack up. Entropy, in other words, is claiming him as well as his single mono-egoic personality disintegrates into this schizophrenia, and his co-workers are complaining that It's not the same Mucho Mas. He walks into a room and it's like a crowd has come in with him. He's got all these different personalities. And so there we have Deleuze and Guattari's model, where they favor the schizophrenic model. And they say at the beginning of A Thousand Plateaus, well, there were two of us, referring to both Deleuze and Guattari, but we were already quite a crowd. So they have this model that the schizophrenic model for the psyche is better. We are multiplicities, fundamentally anyway. But in this novel, that appears as entropy, as degradation. And she realizes that Mucho has gone over the far edge. Also, all these people going crazy around her, all her encounters end up poisonous somehow. They end up falling apart, ending up in causing her further alienation and isolation, even as she's discovering that Tristero is an underground movement for connecting people. Somehow it's having the effect of distancing her and poisoning all her relations. So she's decided she's going to go back to Echo Courts, to her motel room, and that's how chapter 5 ends. So there's one more chapter left.